about conducting EDI assessments. An EDI assessment is about evaluating or assessing an organization to see how diverse or how inclusive it is. So, does the organization consist almost entirely of men? Are all of the employees white or almost all of the employees? Do any of the employees have a disability? Are there Indigenous employees, newcomers? What about racialized newcomers? And how do people feel? Do employees generally feel a sense of respect? Do they feel valued? Do they feel like they belong? And if not, what can be done to going forward so that they do feel valued and they do feel like they belong? In EDI, we measure things by conducting EDI assessments. There are 3 key types of EDI assessments: demographic assessments, employee engagement assessments, and policy reviews. So let's get into it, starting with demographic assessments. A demographic assessment involves collecting and analyzing demographic data. Demographic data is data that has to do with employees' identities and the social categories they belong to. So it has to do with things like age, race, disability, indigeneity, gender, citizenship status, and sexual orientation, things we talked about in Module 2. Demographic assessments show us how an organization is doing in terms of diversity. So they show us how diverse an organization is. A diverse organization is ultimately one that has achieved proportional representation. Let me give you an example. If Indigenous people make up 7% of the Canadian population and roughly 7% of employees at a given organization are Indigenous, that organization would have achieved proportional representation. If only 1 or 2% of employees were Indigenous, the organization would have failed to achieve proportional representation. And Indigenous people should not just make up 7% of the organization overall. They should make up 7% of each team or division. For instance, 7% of the sales team, 7% of the finance department, 7% of marketing, 7% of human resources, and 7% of leadership. Because if all of your Indigenous employees were relegated or confined to one department or one part of the organization, then you haven't really achieved proportional representation. Demographic data is great because it can be used to identify disparities or gaps like these. And once you've identified an organization's gaps, so its weaknesses, you can develop a plan or strategy to address them, meaning there's no ambiguity or uncertainty about what needs to be prioritized when it comes to EDI, specifically when it comes to setting EDI goals, something we'll talk more about in Lesson 4. The easiest and most popular way to gather demographic data is through surveys. Surveys that'll provide you with information on employees' identities and the social categories they belong to. These surveys need to be anonymous. There's a lot of things to think about when it comes to employees' privacy and data security. People have done a lot of research and written a lot of blogs and articles about this, and I encourage you to do some research of your own later on. For now, though, let's talk a little bit about employee engagement assessments. Employee engagement assessments help us determine how employees are feeling or how engaged they are in terms of EDI. So, do they feel included? Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like organizations care about them? And do they feel like the organization is doing enough when it comes to EDI? There are 3 ways to collect this kind of data. The first is through surveys. Surveys are the least time-consuming option. They are good because respondents can remain anonymous, meaning they are more likely to provide honest answers. However, the data you get from a survey is not going to be as detailed as the data you get from interviews or focus groups. These are the 2 other options when it comes to employee engagement assessments. In an interview, you meet with employees one-on-one, asking them about whether they feel valued and respected, and so on. In a focus group, you facilitate or moderate a discussion amongst employees. So you start a conversation around inclusion, asking employees where they feel the organization is lacking and where it's doing well in terms of EDI. Interviews and focus groups are good because you can ask follow-up questions and potentially get more detailed answers. However, they're more time-consuming and your colleagues may not feel comfortable answering these questions face-to-face. That is, they may not feel comfortable critiquing or criticizing the organization in front of you. If you're unsure about what type of employee engagement assessment to conduct, I recommend asking your colleagues what they would prefer, because in the end, that is how you are going to get the best data. Employee engagement assessments, like demographic assessments, provide insight on what an organization is doing well and what it is not doing so well. They shed light, so to speak, on the organization's weaknesses, meaning you can make a plan to address these weaknesses. Now, let's talk a little bit about policy reviews, the 3rd type of EDI assessment. A policy review involves reviewing or evaluating your organization's official documents to see how inclusive they are. You want to be sure policies and their other official documents reflect key EDI principles, things like accessibility, accountability, and intersectionality. So your policy should make your workplace as accessible as possible. They should also address the question of accountability. So it should be clear in any policy who is going to be held accountable for the success or implementation of that policy. Your policies should also take intersectionality into account. This means considering how different identities or social categories intersect, shaping the way employees will experience or be affected by this policy. For example, how is this policy going to affect employees who have disabilities? How is it going to affect racialized newcomers? And how is it going to affect racialized newcomers who have disabilities? If you would like to learn more about intersectionality, I recommend checking out Lesson 5 in Module 2. Ultimately, you want your policies to make it easier to achieve your EDI goals, not harder. I've broken down the policy review process into 4 steps. Step 1. So, the first step is analyzing existing policies to check for anything that might cause harm. For example, sections or clauses that promote systems like racism or ableism. There are checklists you can find online that will help with this. They will tell you what to look for in terms of racism and ableism and so on. Step 2. The second step is either removing or rewriting these sections. So you can either just remove the harmful parts entirely if they are not super important, or if they are important, you can rewrite them so that they are not harmful and do not promote systems like racism or ableism. Step 3. Once you know that your policies are not actively harming people, you can move on to step 3. Step 3 is improving your policies, so adding to them, because we don't want our policies to just not hurt people. We don't want them to just be neutral. We want them to improve our workplaces, making them more inclusive and accessible. I recommend starting with inclusive language, checking to see where the wording could be more inclusive. I would also recommend using plain language, language that is easily understood by everyone, regardless of their background or areas of expertise. The third thing I would recommend is considering the needs of different groups of people. For example, the specific needs of queer employees or employees with autism or ADHD. What do they need in order to succeed? And what could you do to add to your policy to ensure those needs are met? This is where intersectionality comes into play, because nobody is just queer or just neurodivergent. The experiences of queer employees are shaped by factors like age, race, citizenship, status, mental health, gender, and more. Same with neurodivergent employees. Their experiences are shaped by lots of different factors, not just neurodivergence. So this brings us to step 4. Once you've dealt with existing policies, you can start to look into new policies, policies that actively promote inclusion and are going to help your organization achieve its EDI goals. Consider, for example, an accommodation policy, a pay equity policy, a work from home policy, an equal opportunity policy, or an inclusive language policy. There are also flexible work policies, anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policies, conflict resolution policies, policies for reporting, policies for training and development, policies for employee resource groups, and more. I encourage you to do some of your own research here. Look into different types of policies, specifically policies related to EDI. See what might be helpful for your organization, because every organization is going to be a little different. Overall, EDI assessments are going to be the key to the success of any EDI strategy. This is because they help you identify areas for improvement. Without an EDI assessment, it's hard to know how well your organization is doing in terms of diversity and inclusion. And it's hard to set EDI goals or develop an effective EDI strategy for the future if you don't know where you're at in the present. When you take action without having first conducted an EDI assessment, you're at risk of directing your time and energy towards things that aren't totally necessary or important, instead of things that are really necessary or really important. And this brings us to the end of Lesson 3. Well, almost. First, I want to remind you that you don't have to do these things in any particular order. Each lesson in this module covers one component of an EDI strategy, but you don't need to do things in this order if it doesn't work for you or your organization. You could also try to conduct an EDI assessment before forming a committee, and once you have both the committee and the data from the assessment, then you put together a committee. The quote-unquote right move is going to vary from organization to organization. Second, I want to talk about those 3 Jedi Hub lenses: disability, indigeneity, and racialized newcomer status. When it comes to policy reviews and to write policies, it's important that we have proper representation. Just like we talked about with EDI committees, we should have a diversity of people reviewing or writing our organization's policies. This is because 1, we want our policies to reflect the people we're writing them for, and 2, diverse teams statistically are higher performing teams. And this brings us to the end of Lesson 3 for real. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.